All right. So this idea was initially spawned, I would say, less than a few months after I first read The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. As I've stated, he is one of history's most renowned warriors, and many of the lessons he teaches are priceless. I can't even express the sensations one feels when they get into the zone, whether it's in sports or in combat. And when you can see with more than just eyes, that is not just some sort of fantasy thing that's like, ooh, how mysterious for like a movie. No, that's a very real thing where actually looking at your target sometimes puts you at a disadvantage. There's a moment when you tap into that where you want to put your head down because A, you can still see your opponents mostly and they can't see most of your eyes, but also you're seeing with more than eyes. You are tapping into something that even I, with my ability to describe, from my experience, basically anything that other people cannot, I'm still able to effectively describe. Even self-consciousness, for example, on a mere napkin with shapes and lines. My experience has been I can find a way to describe and explain something to anyone. I have no real way to explain this. The best thing I can figure out is that it is a combination of leaning on like auditory, sensorial, like tactile, like feeling vibrations and stuff, but that doesn't seem to account for all of it. I feel like there must be like an electromagnetic or some other sort of element because there are no words to describe that feeling, and no one has done a better job of describing that and how to hone that to a perfect knife's edge than Miyamoto Musashi. So half of this was inspired by a desire to honor him, as he has so incredibly generously honored us by writing down these lessons, and so well written and brief as to share these things with future generations. And while it is true, I will say that one has to have a certain natural ability to have those senses and everything, it's also something one can hone. And without someone such as him and this book, we as warriors would be very sorely lacking. It teaches very strong foundational principles also, like how you have to be completely at peace with yourself to be an effective warrior, because if you don't have that balance internally, when you have a completely clear mind, heart, and spirit, it is like you are a crystalline pond, completely clear, no dirt, and not a single ripple on its surface. You are incredibly dangerous because all you are is ferocious intent and strength, and there is nothing standing between you and your goal. Whereas the other party, if they have some sort of internal perturbation of any kind, like emotional, mental, spiritual, it will be as if they are standing in deep mud, and they will be severely impeded from engaging in combat properly. So, first of all, I wanted to really strongly honor him, and secondly, I was watching an anime that is extremely popular. It's basically known as the hip-hop anime. It incorporates hip-hop throughout the anime, about samurai, about ronin, like rogue samurai, that are helping protect this girl on a very fun, quirky journey. So this first started, I just kind of scribbled down this idea for a board where I thought, okay, what a fun concept, a play on words. I'll call it a crossing of swords, and it will be a more or less chess-like game, or more like checkers, where most of the pieces are all the same on both sides. And it'll also involve strategically using your terrain, like I said. In this case, one of the core ideas was crossing the river. So there are two bridges, as well as a different type of ground and a different means of crossing of a riverbed with stones. Then there's like little Buddha statues, rock outcroppings, Zen gardens, and a little castle for each side where the shogun, the king essentially, resides. And whereas I had never been introduced to Shang-Chi, the Chinese chess, it actually incorporates two of the same elements. The board is actually fairly similar looking, just minus the bridges, in that there's a river here that you have to get your pawns and such to cross. And there's a castle on each side where your king is and can't leave. And there are also two little like advisors that can't leave. And I did incorporate that after the fact. So in any event, that's what the map looked like. And then I went ahead and I took the idea, like I said, the rock, paper, scissors of like, okay, the three types of initiative: attacking, waiting to receive an attack, or body, where you stay close to them. One of them will beat the other, rock, paper, scissors. But then, and why I bring this up, what I started to encounter as a difficulty is, again, one of the main reasons I did this, besides just enjoying board games and feeling I could create a chess or checkers-like equivalent that was brand new and fun in its own right, it was to honor Miyamoto Musashi and the lessons he tries to teach us. And so, besides just those three initiatives, I also started jotting down all of these descriptions that he also includes, all of these like specific attack types, like no thought, no concept strike, which is to, again, have like the most clear mind possible, specifically or especially when you know your opponent is about to attack aggressively just as you are. Then you have to cut the thread. No thought, nothing, just immediate action, and trust yourself and your instincts and apply all force and overcome them before with greater power and speed than they can overcome you. So I thought to myself, oh goodness, I can take a couple of these sorts of like different strikes that he suggests in very creative, artistic descriptions, like pressing down the pillow, to like suppress your opponent. They're very artistically phrased by him. So I thought to myself, what if for each of the three initiatives, there are three different stances? There are three different sub-choices you can choose in this game of rock, paper, scissors. Because I really wanted to include as much as I could of his ideas in this. However, that started to get overly complex. That started to create all sorts of problems as I began to be able to realize most of this and build on the concepts, because it starts creating issues like what can I even possibly assign mechanic-wise to these stances, these sub-initiatives, that would give them a reason to exist? Well, especially with what many of these do, based on how he describes them, I can fairly easily assign, like whether it's attacking, waiting, or body. But many of them feel like they're very clear, like, oh, that would fall under the attack initiative, but it would be particularly good at thwarting either waiting or body. So I would have it do some sort of sub-effect, like, okay, maybe the waiting initiative is supposed to always, in the rock, paper, scissors, beat the attack initiative, but then maybe one of those sub-initiatives for attack is to not win a battle against a waiting initiative, but to just merely safely escape it without that piece being captured. But then you start encountering problems like, then what's the point of the rock, paper, scissors thing if they can just choose the right sub-initiative and basically completely break that mechanic? And that besides, if I really want to have those different ground types on the board of like, oh, shifting ground for the sand in the Zen garden and for the rock, the riverbed. So that's shifting ground. And I wanted to have that have some purpose, right? So then I have to say, what does a given ground type do? Does it limit some of those initiatives? Does it power some up? Well, the easiest thing and the thing that falls most in line with the soul of what I'm trying to create would be that it limits it, so that you don't want to find yourself on certain ground when your opponent is pressing a certain way and you think it's going to create a disadvantage in that rock, paper, scissors game. But then, if one of the pieces of terrain, one of the ground types, if that completely disallows an entire initiative, then there's only two left, and it's no longer rock, paper, scissors game. it breaks down the entire rock, paper, scissors mechanic. Okay, well, fuck. Then does it limit sub-initiatives? But then it gets so overly complex and convoluted that it's nearly impossible for the average person to pick up easily, and it's not very feasible for the average person to play unless they're kind of high-functioning and very calculating. It won't be much fun or very feasible to play even for a more experienced player. Okay, so it's then I'm like, what do I do? Do I just completely, in revisiting this, I started to go, maybe I will completely remove the sub-initiatives, and it'll just go back to the simple rock, paper, scissors. But then, once again, what do those environmental things do? What is their purpose? Well, if they cancel out one of the initiatives, again, I'm back to that same problem of, then there's only two options. It's not rock, paper, scissors. Doesn't involve cleverly guessing your opponent's mind as much. Okay, that's why when I last spoke to you, I said maybe I'm going to have them power things up. But then once again, I go into the same sort of problem as the sub-initiatives, that like if I'm giving them, doing something extra, it gets kind of convoluted again, and I could not figure out how to solve this problem. Well, tonight I finally arrived at a solution that I think is pretty fantastic. It involves simplicity and it involves intuition, so that not only is this easy to read in the instructions, but intuitively makes sense, so it's easy to learn and apply. And on which note, something I've noticed in going back, one of the biggest problems I've had with any of these ideas, particularly my early game ideas, is, what's the term? Just like an overabundance of mechanics. It just gets so massively overly complex that in the best case scenario, you would really need like some program to be calculating dice rolls and stuff for the average little attack between pieces and things. But in going back and trying to do serious consolidations, very many rounds of serious consolidation on artistic ideas and additions that I had to these games while smoking and high, one of the things I realized is that it's not just about what mechanics you do and don't include, it's how they're written down in the rule book. Because, for example, let me grab here real quick. What's easier to look at? Some kind of overly filled in the page like chicken scratch, like something like that, which obviously would not be what it looked like at the end, but all the same, where it's overly wordy and visually cluttered, or something like that, that merely goes over, okay, there's 3 kinds of units for each player. Samurai, they each have 9 of those pieces. Here's how it moves in very simple terms, and they all read roughly the same. Here's how it attacks, how it engages in combat. Here is, lastly, how it gains the little special power-up if it either captures a unit, or if there aren't very many, if there's less than half of your remaining samurai on the board, they all get the 2 heavens, 1 way technique that Miyamoto made very popular. One of his many things that he went over was, why would you have a weapon on hand? All the samurai were carrying 2 swords, so if they dropped one or lost one in combat, they could use the other. And his whole spiel was, that's fucking ridiculous. Like, you should be making use of every single weapon on hand, whether it's a board from a fence, or if you've got 2 swords on your hips, well, goddamn it, you better be using 2 swords, 1 in each hand. And surely it will be heavy and difficult, especially the larger of the swords, to wield with one hand at first, but that doesn't make it any less necessary to become able to do so. So his 2 heavens, 1 way or 1 style, was very like foundational, and it changed the game in terms of martial combat at that time. So that is something that your main samurai pieces can acquire under certain conditions. Once again then, for the magistrate pieces, I just go over moves. How it moves, how it attacks, how it gains or doesn't gain the special trait. Lastly, your king, how it moves, how it, attacks, how it does or doesn't get that trait. when it is visually simple, in, for example, the second and last example of that, ground types. I make a little grid here. Here they are numbered. Here in parentheses are the 1 or 2 tiles on the board that fall under that category. Like, for example, shifting ground is the riverbed and the Zen Gardens. Enclosed ground is on the bridges across the river and in the gates to each castle. And then what sorts of stances are allowed? So I finally solved my problem. Not only, as you see here, I completely removed one of the ground types and consolidated it into another, because otherwise what I realized is that if I want to have 3 stances for each initiative, and my first thought was, okay, so each of these limits some of those, right? It's not going to limit one of the ground types, will not limit an entire initiative, because as I said, that breaks the rock, paper, scissors mechanic. But maybe each of these ground types simply prevents you from doing one initiative from each, or one stance from each initiative. So like you can't do the first of the 3 stances for each initiative when you're on this ground, but you can do the other 2. Once again, that's overly complex. For each of the ground types, you're having to remember like 6 things instead of 3. So I reversed it and I made it so each of the ground types only allows for one type of stance under each initiative. Sure, you can still pick every single one of the rock, paper, scissors option, but you can only pick one of the sub 3 options for each initiative. One stance for each initiative when on that ground type. In the course of doing that, assigning like 1-1, 2-1, 3-1, that's, what's going to be capable on that ground type. That's what forced me to realize I have one extra ground type. Is there any way I can consolidate it down into another one? Molto bello. One of those other ground types only applied to one sort of tile. So did another. I was able, and still making it intuitive, to combine those into one ground type, which then allowed me to apply this system for what each ground type allows. Because without that, I never would have been able to make this entire thing work. I was at a dead standstill. There was no way to forward this game without it breaking the core mechanics entirely, making them pointless, or just being so convoluted that no one would want to play it even if they could be bothered to learn it. With some simple reorganization and talking to myself out loud, I talk through almost everything that I'm doing because it is so, again, differential equations. I am juggling 10 different concepts. Okay, based on that, and I am closing this off, I promise. This is my updated version of what the board will look like. Ignore these, that was just gridded unnecessarily. So I've changed some of where things are. I've also changed the fact that now, like Chinese and Japanese chess, you move on the intersections of spaces. You don't land on the space itself. Excuse me. Let's pretend that was intentional. So in the course of that, though, then it begs the question, for example, okay, based on the scale of the board as well as the organization of elements, if they are to enact their intended purpose of like limiting things and allowing creative combat between them, then I need to determine the right scale of the board and the distance between the different ground types. I need to then determine, according to that, based on what I've tried to tentatively determine as the scale and the placement of the map and its elements, then what would that mean is appropriate for how far each given piece type can move? Okay, well, for the samurai, I was thinking one only orthogonally. All right, that limits it, so then you can't move far enough, especially with the scale of the board as it tentatively is. So then I need to either make them move more spaces each, or perhaps I need to allow the player to move multiple pieces in a given turn. Okay, well then, what if there's the situation that a player is in a poor position and they don't want to move pieces? Maybe they only want to move one where they're able to move 2 in a turn, Or maybe they don't want to move anywhere they're able to move to because they feel correctly or incorrectly that it will disadvantage them. Well, that's a problem because that sort of, the allowance for that sort of logistical approach will break down the game. It will cause like an indefinite stalemate, or it will just bring the game to a crawl, essentially. So you have to prevent that. Okay, so then you have to move at least 2 pieces. And okay, they should probably be both the samurai because the king and the 2 advisors, they have to stay in the castle. And I don't want the player to use that as an excuse to not move. I'm going to move like 1 or no samurai to actually any meaningful end in the gameplay. And I'm just going to dance around my units within my castle till my enemy comes at me on my terms. Breaks the game. Okay, so then, again, that begs the question of how many units can they move? How many spaces do each of those move? Do they move diagonally, exclusively orthogonally, any direction? It is such an extraordinary balancing of a nigh infinite amount of elements, and especially the more you add any kind of tiny mechanic to the game, just like with coding, you change one thing to solve one bug, and it creates like 10 other bugs, and you're just chasing that problem near indefinitely and like tearing your hair out. Speaking from what people have described to me, I've experienced that process in game design, but I've just known roommates and friends who were computer science majors, and they've described that to me. So it is incredibly intense. So for right now, for example, I was able, by talking to myself for about 40 minutes straight, and talking this all through. Okay, so if I do that, that breaks this element. Okay, don't lose that. And then, why was I even changing that element? It becomes necessary because those 2 now elements, those do work. And I feel like I can keep that, and that can probably remain static, even when I change other things. I think that'll remain in place now. But I can't say for certain, okay, but now I have to change this. It is intense. So where I've landed right now, after that, is like I have all of my 5 different ground types. Very intuitively, it's just open ground. You can do all of any initiative or stance. The following other 3 ground types, you can do ground type, 1 below that. You can do the first stance of each initiative. The next one that's not open ground, you can do the second